January 1945, somewhere inside the collapsing Third Reich, the snow had hardened into gray ice along the barbed wire. Inside the perimeter of a Luftwaffe and prisoner of war camp, American airmen stood in uneven lines for morning roll call. Their boots were worn thin, their jackets patched and repatched. Behind them, wooden barracks leaned against the winter wind, smoke rising faintly from iron stoves that barely fought the cold. The guards watched from the towers, rifles slung casually, cigarettes burning slowly, confidence still clinging to routine. They had heard the distant thunder for months now, the steady, mechanical growl that crossed German skies every day. The Reich was shrinking, cities were burning. But here, behind wire and discipline, the war felt contained, predictable. Some guards joked that the Americans in captivity were safer than their comrades at the front. Then the sound grew louder. Not the scattered hum of reconnaissance planes. Not a stray formation blown off course. This was different. Heavy, layered, relentless. The air itself began to vibrate. And for the first time, the men inside the towers looked up not with amusement, but with doubt. Because the sky over Germany in 1945 belonged to someone else. The sky turns against Germany by January 1945. The war in Europe had entered its final and most destructive phase. The Allied strategy of strategic bombing, debated in planning rooms, as early as 1941, had matured into a relentless industrial assault. What began as tentative daylight raids over occupied France had become a sustained campaign aimed at dismantling the German war machine piece by piece. At its center stood the American 8th Air Force based in eastern England. From airfields carved into the English countryside, thousands of heavy bombers launched daily toward targets deep inside the Reich, factories, oil refineries, rail hubs, ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel facilities, anything that fed Germany's capacity to fight. In 1943, missions had carried devastating losses: Schweinfurt, Regensburg. Crews shot down in daylight by fighters and flak. Survival rates were grim, yet by mid-1944 everything had changed. The long-range escort fighters arrived, the P-51 Mustang, with drop tanks, extending its reach to Berlin and beyond, transformed the air war. German interceptors were hunted aggressively. The Luftwaffe's experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. By late 1944, Allied bombers flew with growing confidence. The oil campaign accelerated the collapse. Synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Merseburg, and Peplitz were struck repeatedly. Rail lines were shredded, bridges cratered. Germany's mechanized army began to run on fumes. Armored divisions sat immobile for lack of gasoline. Training flights were canceled. Fighter sorties declined. The Reich still possessed weapons. It still possessed men. But it was running out of mobility. Meanwhile, on the ground, the map was closing in. To the west, American and British forces had crossed into Germany following the breakout from Normandy. Despite the shock of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Allied lines held. The German counteroffensive drained precious reserves. What remained of the Wehrmacht retreated toward the Rhine. To the east, the Red Army unleashed a massive winter offensive in January 1945. Soviet forces tore through Poland and surged toward the Oder River. Cities that once lay comfortably behind the front were suddenly within artillery range. Germany was being compressed, and inside that compression stood hundreds of prisoner of war camps scattered across the Reich, holding British, American, Canadian, French, Polish, and Soviet captives. For captured Allied airmen, imprisonment followed a grim sequence. Shot down over enemy territory. Parachuting into farmland or city streets. Sometimes beaten by civilians in fury over bombing raids, then interrogation by the Luftwaffe's intelligence service. After processing, most American flyers were sent to designated airmen's camps known as Stalag Luft. Unlike camps run by the SS, these installations were administered by the German Air Force, under the 1929 Geneva Convention. Captured airmen were entitled to specific protections: regular rations, male privileges, medical care, and protection from violence. In practice, conditions varied. Food shortages worsened as the war dragged on. Winters were brutal. Red Cross parcels often meant the difference between survival and starvation. Still, these were not extermination camps. They were holding pens for men who had once ruled the sky. By late 1944, thousands of American airmen were confined in camps across Germany and occupied territories. Many had been shot down during the massive bombing offensives of 1943 and 1944. They knew intimately what Allied air power could do to a city. They had seen it from above. Now they watched it from behind barbed wire. At first, guards treated the prisoners with a certain detached superiority. Germany, they believed, remained sovereign over its airspace. Flak batteries still fired. Fighters still rose to meet incoming formations. The Reich was battered, but not broken. But reality was shifting faster than morale. The German air defense network, once dense and coordinated, was fraying. Radar stations were destroyed. Fuel shortages grounded interceptors. Anti-aircraft ammunition was rationed. Bombers that once faced swarms of defenders increasingly encountered only scattered resistance. And the formations kept growing. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s in tight combat boxes, layer upon layer. High altitude. Sunlight glinting off aluminum. Trails of condensation stretching across the winter sky. To German civilians, the sound became routine dread. To prisoners of war, it became something more complicated. Hope. Because every passing formation meant the war was moving closer to its end. Yet there was one dangerous truth about strategic bombing in 1945. Accuracy was never absolute. Bombs aimed at rail yards sometimes fell into neighborhoods. Targets obscured by cloud cover were struck using radar approximations. Industrial facilities located near civilian or military housing blurred the margin between precision and catastrophe. And many prisoner of war camps were located near rail lines, near factories, near transportation hubs. As Germany's infrastructure became the primary objective of Allied planners, the geography of captivity grew increasingly perilous. The men inside those camps understood this. The guards, perhaps, did not. Because as January deepened and bomber formations intensified, the war in the sky was no longer something happening at a distance. It was moving inward, toward places that had once seemed insulated. Toward one particular camp where mockery would soon give way to something far less certain. The camp that sat too close to the target in the western reaches of Germany, not far from the industrial arteries feeding the Ruhr, stood Stalag Luft 4, one of several Luftwaffe-operated camps holding captured Allied airmen. Originally established in 1944 in what was then German-occupied Pomerania, the camp had grown rapidly as bomber losses mounted. By late autumn, thousands of American, British, Canadian, Australian, and Polish airmen were confined behind its wire. The camp consisted of wooden barracks arranged in compounds, guard towers at each corner, and double fencing reinforced with barbed wire and patrol paths. It was not a death camp. It was not hidden in forest secrecy. It was a visible installation, structured, regulated, and officially bound by the Geneva Convention. But it stood near rail lines. And in 1945, rail lines were lifelines. By January, Allied planners had shifted strategic emphasis toward crippling German transportation networks. Bridges, marshalling yards, switching stations, anything that allowed troops or supplies to move, became high-priority targets. Bombing accuracy had improved with radar systems like H-2X, but winter weather over Europe remained unpredictable. Cloud cover obscured visual identification. Crews sometimes relied on dead reckoning or radar returns that blurred civilian and military structures together. Rail complexes were rarely isolated, they were embedded within towns, industrial areas, sometimes near military installations, including POW camps that had been deliberately located close to infrastructure for logistical convenience. Inside the camp, daily life had settled into rhythm. Roll call at dawn, thin rations, occasional Red Cross parcels, if trains were running, makeshift libraries, handwritten newspapers, secret radios assembled from smuggled components, tunnels half-finished and abandoned when discovered. American airmen retained discipline in captivity. Senior officers organized compounds. Escape committees operated quietly. Intelligence gathering continued. Morale was maintained through structure. The guards, many of them older reservists or younger recruits unfit for frontline service, rotated shifts in watchtowers. Some were rigid and formal. Others were openly resentful. The bombing of German cities had hardened attitudes. Hamburg had burned in 1943. Berlin endured repeated raids. Cologne, Dresden, Leipzig, names whispered with bitterness. Guards sometimes reminded prisoners of those fires. "You wanted to bomb Germany," one might mutter during inspection. "Now you can listen to it." The mockery was not constant, but it surfaced, especially when distant formations passed overhead. Some guards would gesture upward with ironic smiles, suggesting that the Americans' own comrades were turning Germany into ash. Yet confidence still lingered in the towers. The Reich had survived for years under bombardment. Factories rebuilt, debris cleared, air defenses adapted. There was a belief, increasingly fragile, that even overwhelming force could be endured, but by early 1945, endurance was turning into exhaustion. Fuel shortages meant fewer interceptors scrambled to meet incoming raids. Flak batteries still thundered, but coordination faltered. Allied fighters roamed freely at low altitude, strafing rail traffic and military convoys. The sky no longer belonged to Germany. And then came the transportation offensive of early 1945, designed not just to damage, but to paralyze. Rail junctions across western and central Germany were struck repeatedly. Entire switching yards were reduced to twisted steel. Signals destroyed, locomotives shattered. Bridges dropped into rivers. Bombing patterns widened. Missions launched from English airfields often involved over 1,000 heavy bombers in coordinated waves. Formation leaders navigated through flak corridors and cloud layers, guided by radar operators when visibility failed. Even a minor navigational deviation could shift a bomb pattern hundreds of yards. Hundreds of yards could mean the difference between rails and roofs. Inside Stalag Luft 4, the prisoners had begun noticing something unsettling. Bombs were landing closer. Not directly on the camp, not yet, but nearer than before. The concussion from distant strikes rattled barrack walls. Windows vibrated, dust sifted from rafters. Guards who once smirked during overflights now checked the horizon more carefully. Because infrastructure around the camp was being hit repeatedly, the nearby rail facilities were no longer peripheral targets. They were central objectives in a campaign to choke Germany's last operational arteries, and winter weather made precision fragile. Low cloud ceilings forced reliance on radar bombing. Visual confirmation became secondary. In dense industrial regions, radar returns did not distinguish between warehouse, depot, or barracks. To Allied planners, a rail junction was a rail junction. On mission maps, thousands of feet above the ground, prisoner-of-war camps were marked, but proximity to strategic targets created a narrow margin of safety. The prisoners understood this with growing clarity. They had flown missions themselves. They knew that once bomb bay doors opened, gravity decided the rest. By mid-January, tension inside the camp shifted from routine endurance to quiet anticipation. Not of liberation, that still seemed distant, but of uncertainty. The guards noticed it too. Some dismissed the fear. Others began spending more time near bunkers during air raid sirens. Procedures were reviewed. Shelter locations were identified. Orders clarified, but war does not wait for clarity. On the morning that would change everything, the sky above Western Germany filled once again with the layered hum of vengeance. This time, the target lay dangerously close. For the men inside the compound, captivity was a suspended existence. Most had been shot down months earlier, some over the Ruhr, others over Berlin or oil refineries in central Germany. They remembered the flak bursts, the shudder of aluminum skin torn open mid-air, the smell of burning insulation. The moment when altitude disappeared and parachute silk snapped them back into silence, capture had followed quickly. Interrogation at transit camps like Stalag Luft had been methodical, not theatrical. German intelligence officers, fluent in English, attempted to extract squadron information and bombing tactics. Most airmen gave only name, rank, and serial number. After processing, they were shipped east or west by rail, packed into boxcars, guarded but not brutalized. By early 1945, thousands of these airmen were held across the shrinking Reich, in camps like WWII, WWII, and others scattered near transportation hubs. Daily life became structured resistance routine, preserved identity. Morning roll calls in snow and sleet. Exercise circuits around compound perimeters. Educational classes taught by former professors and engineers. Makeshift orchestras. Chess tournaments carved from scrap wood. And always, the sky. The airmen could distinguish engine notes by ear. They knew the difference between a B-17 Flying Fortress and a B-24 Liberator long before shapes emerged through cloud breaks. When formations passed overhead, prisoners often stood still and counted. 100 bombers, 200, more. Some felt pride. Some felt dread, because they understood something the guards did not fully grasp. Bombing was never surgical in winter. Wind drifted bombs, radar returned imperfect outlines. Release points were calculated at altitude under pressure. Even a disciplined formation could scatter. Explosives across a wide pattern. The men inside the wire had once dropped those bombs themselves. Now they were directly beneath them. Conversations in the barracks grew more cautious as January deepened. If rail yards near the camp were targeted, and they increasingly were, how close would the pattern fall? Escape committees still planned tunnels. Intelligence officers still gathered scraps of information. But a new vulnerability emerged. They were no longer simply prisoners of Germany. They were prisoners of geography. In geography, in 1945, was a liability. Yet even under threat, humor persisted. When sirens wailed in distant towns, some prisoners would look at each other and say quietly, "That's ours." It was half pride, half prayer. They believed the bombers signaled progress, the end of captivity, the shortening of war. They did not yet imagine that those same bombers could transform their camp into a target-adjacent casualty zone within minutes. Because faith in precision remained strong, even among those who knew better. In the towers, perspective was different. Most guards assigned to Luftwaffe and POW camps were not frontline veterans of the Eastern Front. Many were older reservists, Air Force ground personnel, or soldiers medically unfit for combat. They wore uniforms, carried rifles, and enforced regulations, but their war experience was uneven. They too had watched Germany change. In 1942 and 1943, air raids were disruptive but survivable. Civil defense crews restored order, factories resumed output. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda projected resilience. Even after catastrophic bombings like Hamburg's Operation Gomorrah, official messaging emphasized endurance and eventual victory, but by late 1944, confidence was thinning. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded. Paris had fallen. The Battle of the Bulge, initially hailed as a bold counterstroke, had stalled and then collapsed under fuel shortages and overwhelming Allied air power. Guards stationed at POW camps received filtered news. They read military bulletins. Some listened secretly to foreign broadcasts. Many had family in bombed cities. The destruction was no longer abstract, and yet within the camp perimeter a fragile hierarchy persisted. They still held authority, they still counted the prisoners, they still locked the gates. Mockery, when it occurred, was often defensive. When bomber formations passed overhead, some guards would shout up toward the sky, then glance at the prisoners with forced bravado. "Your friends are missing the target again," or "maybe today they will bomb themselves." It was less cruelty than assertion, a reminder that captivity reversed power, at least locally. But as January 1945 progressed, something shifted in tone. The formations were growing larger. Air raid sirens sounded more frequently, and occasionally explosions landed close enough to shake the guard towers themselves. Confidence erodes quietly. A guard who once stood exposed in the tower during overflights might now step back toward the ladder. Another might ask a superior officer about bunker access procedures. Reports from nearby towns described entire rail depots flattened in single raids. The Reich's air defenses were visibly weakening. Interceptors appeared less often. Flak bursts were fewer and less coordinated. Some guards began to understand a sobering truth. If bombs fell inside the camp perimeter, there would be no meaningful distinction between prisoner and captor. Both were beneath the same sky, and the sky, increasingly, was ruled by engines that did not discriminate. On the morning when that realization would be tested, routine still unfolded. Roll call, inspection. Cold wind across snow-packed ground, but far to the west, beyond sight and beyond immediate comprehension. Heavy bombers were already assembling into combat formations over England, and their plotted course would pass dangerously close to the wire. By 1945, American strategic bombing doctrine rested on a powerful belief: precision could win wars. At the heart of that belief was the Norden bombsight, a mechanical analog computer designed to calculate release points based on speed, altitude, wind drift, and target trajectory. In training films, it was described as capable of placing a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Reality was more complicated. High-altitude daylight bombing required stable formations, clear visibility, and minimal wind variation. Over Germany in winter, those conditions rarely aligned. Cloud decks obscured visual targets. Jet stream waves pushed bomb loads off intended coordinates. Flak bursts forced formation adjustments at critical moments. When visual identification failed, bombardiers relied on radar systems such as H-2X, nicknamed Mickey by crews. Radar could identify large industrial shapes or rail complexes beneath cloud cover, but it could not distinguish a freight yard from adjacent barracks or administrative buildings with perfect clarity. Bomb release was collective. Once the lead bombardier triggered his drop, aircraft in the formation released simultaneously. A split-second deviation in timing could shift a bomb pattern hundreds of yards. Multiply that by hundreds of aircraft carrying thousands of pounds of high explosives, and the margin between intended and unintended damage narrowed quickly. Rail junctions were among the most common targets in early 1945. Transportation had become Germany's Achilles heel. Without rail movement, troops could not redeploy. Fuel could not reach armored divisions. Replacement parts stalled in transit. The bombing of switching yards and bridges was designed to freeze the Reich in place. But rail yards were rarely isolated on empty plains. They were embedded in towns, adjacent to warehouses. Near worker housing. And in several cases, near prisoner of war camps constructed for logistical convenience. Mission briefings at airfields in England included target maps marked with industrial outlines. Crews were informed of flak concentrations, expected fighter opposition, weather projections. They were not briefed to strike POW camps. Those were prohibited targets under international law and Allied policy. Yet geography did not respect policy. If a rail hub lay within a few hundred meters of a camp perimeter, bombs intended for steel and locomotives could easily fall among wooden barracks and guard towers, and at 25,000 feet, correction after release was impossible. The men in the bombers trusted their calculations. The men on the ground trusted the sky to spare them. Both trusts were fragile. Winter over Germany introduced another variable: visibility. Low cloud ceilings often forced bomber groups to climb above thick layers of overcast. Below them, targets disappeared entirely from view. Navigation relied on radio beacons, dead reckoning, and radar returns that painted industrial zones as vague clusters of brightness. Crosswinds at altitude could drift bomb loads significantly. Even with careful calculation, a slight misjudgment in wind speed translated into displacement on the ground. Flak batteries added further instability. Though Germany's anti-aircraft network was weakening, heavy guns still defended major rail centers. Black bursts of 88mm shells erupted among bomber formations, jarring aircraft and forcing pilots to adjust course or altitude. A formation that shifted a few degrees under flak pressure could carry its bomb pattern off the intended centerline. And then there was simple mechanical unpredictability. Bomb racks occasionally released unevenly. A delay in one aircraft could create staggered impacts. Equipment malfunctions, icing conditions, oxygen system failures all added strain in an environment already defined by precision under pressure. Strategic bombing was industrialized warfare, but it remained dependent on human calculation, a bombardier peering through a sight, a navigator correcting headings, a pilot holding steady amid turbulence and exploding flak. At altitude, they could not hear sirens below. They could not see prisoners in formation for roll call. They saw a target grid, a rail complex, coordinates, and when the lead aircraft reached the computed release point, the command traveled electrically down the formation. Bomb bay doors opened. Thousands of pounds of steel and explosive began falling. Gravity does not discriminate between guard and captive. It does not read Geneva Convention clauses. It simply accelerates. For the prisoners below, the irony was sharp. Many had once flown in those very formations. They had sat at bombardier stations. They had watched crosshairs align over oil refineries and ball-bearing plants. They had trusted mathematics to justify destruction. Now, confined by barbed wire, they found themselves beneath the same doctrine. The guards who had mocked them for months, gesturing skyward, laughing at missed targets, were bound to the same earth. In that moment, uniforms blurred. Power shifted from rifle and key to altitude and release point. And when the sound of engines thickened overhead on that decisive day in January 1945, both prisoner and guard sensed something different in its tone. Not distant, not passing. Approaching. Because this time the plotted line on a mission map ran directly over the rail hub beside the camp. And the sky was no longer a symbol. It was about to become impact. January 1945. The bomb line crosses the wire. The morning broke under a ceiling of pale winter cloud. Inside the camp, roll call had already concluded. Prisoners drifted back toward their barracks, boots crunching against frozen ground. Smoke rose thinly from stovepipes. A few men lingered near the fence line, scanning the horizon out of habit more than expectation. Then the sound began. Faint at first, a layered hum beyond the wind. Men who had flown missions recognized it instantly. Not fighters. Not reconnaissance. Heavy bombers. Within minutes, the vibration intensified. The sky did not clear, but it deepened, filled with mechanical presence. The formation was high, likely above 20,000 feet. Hidden by cloud but unmistakable in weight, sirens wailed from the nearby rail junction. In the guard towers, posture changed. Rifles were set aside. Field glasses lifted. One guard shouted toward the compound for prisoners to clear open areas and return to barracks. Another scrambled down the tower ladder toward the nearest bunker entrance. The American airmen did not run immediately. They counted. The rhythm of engines suggested a large formation, possibly elements of the 8th Air Force operating out of England. Missions of that scale were now common. Rail targets in western Germany had been struck repeatedly in the previous weeks. A few prisoners muttered that the junction would be hit again. No one yet imagined how close the pattern might fall. High above, unseen through cloud cover, dozens of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator aircraft held steady in tight combat boxes. Lead bombardiers peered into their sights, guided by radar returns marking the rail complex below. Flak bursts rose sporadically, less dense than in previous years, but still disruptive. At the calculated release point, bomb bay doors opened, thousands of pounds of high explosive and fragmentation bombs dropped in synchronized waves. Below, the first detonation struck the rail yard. A deep concussion rolled across the frozen ground. Steel tracks twisted, freight cars flipped. Black smoke erupted in columns. Inside the camp perimeter, windows shattered from the shock wave. Barrack walls shuddered violently. Dust rained from rafters. Men instinctively dropped flat. Then came the second wave. Whether by wind drift, slight navigational deviation, or simple spread of pattern, the bomb line shifted. Explosions landed closer, no longer confined to the rail complex. A blast tore into open ground just beyond the outer fence. Shrapnel ripped through wooden structures. A guard tower splintered at its base, collapsing sideways in a plume of snow and debris. Screams replaced routine. Guards who moments earlier had barked commands now sprinted toward bunkers or lay prone alongside prisoners. Authority dissolved under concussion. Another detonation struck within the camp boundary. A barrack erupted in flame. Roof beams splintered outward. Men inside were thrown against walls or buried beneath collapsing timber. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the metallic scent of explosive residue. There was no time to differentiate between target and accident. The bombing pattern continued. From altitude, the formation moved on, its release completed, its course turning toward home. But on the ground, impact lingered. Secondary explosions from the rail yard sent additional shock waves across the compound. Fire spread quickly among wooden buildings. Snow melted into mud around craters gouged deep into the frozen earth. In one sector of the camp, a group of American prisoners crawled from wreckage, stunned but alive. In another, medics, themselves captives, began pulling injured men from splintered structures. A German guard staggered across open ground, bleeding from a gash in his forehead, shouting for stretcher bearers. Another attempted to organize bucket lines to control the fire. The mockery that once accompanied overflights had vanished entirely. Now there was only survival. The bombing lasted minutes. Its consequences unfolded for hours. When the final rumble faded and the sky returned to distant silence, the camp no longer resembled the orderly compound of that morning. Barracks were shattered, fences torn. Craters pocked the yard. Smoke hung low over snow turned black. And amid the debris lay prisoners and guards alike, victims of a campaign that had aimed for steel and rail, but found wood and flesh in its spread. Yet the full toll was not immediately clear. Rescue efforts began under the fear that additional waves might follow. Because in January 1945, a single bombing pass rarely stood alone, and the day was not yet finished. After the impact, for several minutes after the last explosions, there was only ringing silence. Snow drifted slowly through smoke. Splintered beams smoldered. The sky, moments earlier alive with engines, now felt impossibly distant. Then the sound returned, not from above, but from within the wreckage, shouting, coughing, men calling out names through dust-thick air. Inside what had been one of the main barracks, American prisoners clawed through broken timber with bare hands. The structure had partially collapsed when a bomb detonated near its foundation. Roof beams pinned bunks. Walls had folded inward like paper. Those who could move began lifting debris, ignoring the risk of secondary collapse. A camp medic, himself a captured airman, organized triage in the open yard. Blankets were laid over frozen ground. The injured were carried out one by one. Shrapnel wounds, broken limbs, concussions, burns from ignited stove fuel. Across the compound, German guards did the same. A tower that had stood intact for months now lay shattered beside the fence line. One sentry had been thrown clear by the blast wave. Another was buried beneath timber and snow. Fellow guards, faces gray with shock, worked alongside prisoners without hesitation. In that moment, roles dissolved. There were no commands shouted in mockery. No enforced distance between captor and captive, only men responding to destruction. Fires posed the next threat. The wooden barracks, dry despite winter cold, ignited easily when struck by fragments and incendiary debris from the nearby rail yard. Buckets were filled from a hand pump well inside the compound. Lines formed instinctively. Prisoners and guards passed water together, boots slipping in melted snow and mud. The Geneva Convention required that posts be protected from the hazards of combat. But on that morning, protection had failed not through intent, but through proximity. The rail junction had been the objective. The camp had been collateral geography. Casualty counts emerged slowly. Several American prisoners were confirmed dead, either killed instantly by blast impact or fatally injured beneath collapsed structures. Others were critically wounded. Among the guards, losses were fewer but real. Men who had believed themselves insulated by distance from the front now lay on stretchers beside those they had supervised. Camp command officers, shaken but operational, ordered a full head count once immediate rescue efforts stabilized. Roll call took place amid craters and smoke. Names were shouted into cold air. Some did not answer. For the American prisoners, the irony settled heavily. They had survived flak bursts at altitude. They had bailed out of burning aircraft. They had endured interrogation and captivity. And now they had been struck by bombs dropped by their own side, weapons launched in the name of shortening the war. Yet few voiced anger. Most understood the scale of what was happening beyond the wire. Rail lines were being systematically destroyed across Germany. The transportation grid was collapsing under sustained attack. Armored reinforcements could no longer move freely between fronts. Supplies stalled in ruined depots. The bombing that had struck the camp was part of a larger paralysis spreading through the Reich. As smoke cleared, structural damage became fully visible. Multiple barracks were beyond repair. Sections of perimeter fencing were shredded. Guard towers were splintered. The nearby rail yard was obliterated, tracks bent skyward, locomotives overturned, rail cars reduced to twisted frames. Rail traffic through the junction ceased immediately. In Berlin, such a loss would be recorded as another transportation failure in an already failing network. Inside the camp, it meant something more immediate. The location was no longer secure. German authorities, aware that advancing Allied ground forces were drawing closer from the west, while Soviet forces pressed from the east, had already been contemplating prisoner evacuations. Camps too near strategic targets or front lines posed logistical and political risks. This bombing accelerated the decision. Within days, orders would arrive to relocate the prisoners, not to safer permanent facilities, but onto roads choked with retreating military units and displaced civilians. For now, however, the focus remained on survival. Makeshift morgues were established in one undamaged structure. Chaplains among the prisoners conducted brief services over fallen comrades. Guards removed their caps during prayers, not as captors but as witnesses. The sky, which had once symbolized hope for liberation, now carried a more complicated weight. Because liberation from the air had come at a cost, and, as evening fell over the shattered compound, the men who had once stood on opposite sides of authority understood a shared truth. They were all beneath the same collapsing Reich. The bombing had not erased captivity, but it had erased certainty. And beyond the smoke, a harsher ordeal was already being prepared. The bombing did not end the camp's existence. It ended its stability. Within 48 hours of the strike, German command authorities issued new directives. The rail junction was unusable. Infrastructure around the camp had been crippled, with Allied forces advancing on multiple fronts. Holding thousands of Allied airmen in a damaged facility near a strategic transportation target was no longer sustainable. The order was clear: evacuate. By January 1945, similar orders were spreading across the Reich. As Soviet forces advanced westward and Anglo-American armies pressed from the opposite direction, prisoner of war camps in eastern and central Germany were being emptied. The intention, according to German command memoranda, was to prevent liberation by advancing forces and to relocate prisoners deeper into still controlled territory. In practice, it meant forced march in winter. The men inside the bomb-scarred compound were given minimal notice. They were instructed to pack what they could carry. Personal belongings were reduced to essentials: blankets, tin cups, scraps of food saved from Red Cross parcels. The injured were sorted. Those able to walk were ordered to prepare. Those too severely wounded were either left under limited medical supervision or transported separately by whatever rail remained functional farther from the destroyed junction. The Geneva Convention still technically governed treatment of POWs. German officers were aware that mistreatment could carry consequences after the war, yet resources were collapsing. Food supplies were scarce. Transportation was fragmented. What followed was not a planned relocation with organized logistics. It was movement under pressure. Columns of prisoners were assembled outside the damaged perimeter. Guards, many of them visibly shaken from the bombing days earlier, formed escort units. Snow fell intermittently. Temperatures hovered below freezing. For American airmen who had once flown at altitude over Germany, the war now shifted to ground level. They marched through villages already scarred by air raids. Civilians stared, some with hostility, others with exhaustion. Columns of Wehrmacht soldiers retreated in the opposite direction, faces drawn, equipment incomplete. Refugee carts clogged secondary roads. The bombing of rail lines had achieved its intended operational effect. Movement was chaotic. Trains could no longer reliably transport large numbers of prisoners. Bridges were down, switching yards were craters. What had once been a network of steel arteries had become fractured pathways. So the prisoners walked. These evacuations would later be known collectively as the Long March, or, in some accounts, Death March, though the term varied by region and severity. Conditions differed from column to column. Some guards maintained discipline and ensured minimal rations were distributed. Others, themselves cold and undersupplied, struggled to maintain order. The bombing that had struck the camp was not widely publicized at the time. Allied mission reports recorded destruction of transportation targets. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs showed obliterated rail infrastructure. The proximity of the POW camp was noted in some intelligence summaries. But the scale of collateral damage was not immediately clear within Germany. Local authorities documented casualties among both prisoners and guards. Reports moved upward through Luftwaffe administrative channels. The incident underscored a growing risk. Camps situated near strategic targets were vulnerable as bombing intensified. But by January 1945, strategic restraint was increasingly overshadowed by urgency. The objective was collapse. Rail transport had to be neutralized. Fuel production had to be strangled. Every functioning junction represented continued German mobility. For the prisoners marching through snow-covered roads, strategic logic offered little comfort. Boots wore thin quickly. Frostbite threatened exposed skin. Rations were inconsistent, sometimes supplemented by Red Cross parcels distributed before departure, sometimes reduced to thin soup provided by local authorities. Guards walked beside them, rifles slung, faces pale from cold. The dynamic between captor and captive had subtly shifted since the bombing. Mockery was absent. Conversations, when they occurred, were quieter. Some guards acknowledged openly that the war was nearing its end. Others clung to official statements predicting new weapons or counteroffensives. But the evidence along the roads contradicted optimism: burned rail cars, cratered tracks, abandoned vehicles. The bombing of the camp had been one episode in a broader unraveling. And as columns moved westward, the distance between prisoner and advancing Allied lines narrowed, even as hardship intensified. Because evacuation was not liberation. It was displacement into uncertainty. And winter had not yet loosened its grip. The march from the bombed camp stretched for weeks. Snow-packed roads became rivers of mud and ice. Each day brought exhaustion, hunger, and the ever-present threat of injury. American airmen, still wearing tattered uniforms from months of imprisonment, relied on discipline and mutual support to endure. Senior officers organized rotations, ensuring that the weakest could keep pace. Guards themselves, demoralized and underfed, maintained order but increasingly depended on the prisoners' cooperation. The geography of destruction dictated the route. Rail lines obliterated by Allied bombing forced columns to take secondary roads, winding through villages already scarred by conflict. Bridges destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht units slowed progress, while fields torn by explosives and shell craters created dangerous detours. The march became a test of endurance, a measure of both physical and psychological resilience. Reports collected after the war documented the dual toll of evacuation and previous bombardment. Several prisoners died from exposure, malnutrition, or injuries sustained during the January raids. Others suffered frostbite that left lasting damage. The bombing itself, while tragic in its collateral consequences, had accelerated the decision to move prisoners away from advancing front lines, an evacuation that, paradoxically, likely spared many from capture or death as Soviet and Allied forces advanced. Among surviving prisoners, accounts emphasized the surreal nature of the bombing. One airman noted that the conflation of mockery and destruction left a lasting impression. Guards who had taunted them now crouched beside them in shared fear. Historians later observed that such events blurred traditional lines of power, captor and captive experiencing the same vulnerability under the impartial sky. Official records from the Luftwaffe and Allied intelligence corroborated the sequence. Bombing logs verified target coordinates near the rail hub. Reconnaissance photographs captured the devastation. Civilian witnesses noted extensive damage to surrounding infrastructure. Yet few civilians were present within the immediate camp boundaries, which may have limited the death toll. The incident became a case study in the unpredictable nature of wartime. Bombing campaigns and the inherent risks posed to non-combatants in proximity to strategic objectives. By the time the columns of prisoners reached temporary holding locations deeper in German territory, the war was closing in on every side. Western Allied forces had penetrated the Rhine and advanced into the Ruhr, while Soviet forces pressed from the east. The Reich was crumbling, its transportation network fragmented, its cities devastated, and its authority increasingly tenuous. For the prisoners, survival and endurance remained paramount. Even as the shadow of liberation grew nearer, Each day was marked by the struggle to maintain warmth, avoid injury, and preserve human dignity under extreme conditions. The bombing of their original camp remained a defining moment, a stark lesson in the indiscriminate power of modern warfare, where precision and intent collided with geography and circumstance to produce unintended consequences. Ultimately, the bombing and subsequent evacuation illustrated the convergence of strategic military objectives, technological power, and human vulnerability. The Americans who endured it carried both the memory of destruction and the realization that survival often hinged on adaptation. Discipline and solidarity traits forged in the air over Germany and tested once more on its frozen roads. As winter receded, the survivors continued their march toward the eventual liberation of POWs in spring 1945. Carrying with them the imprint of the sky's impartial judgment and the quiet truth that in total war, even captivity could not shield one from the consequences of the broader conflict. The January bombing of the camp stands as a stark testament to the impartiality of war. The sky does not recognize uniforms, rank, or captivity. It recognizes only altitude, coordinates, and momentum. Men who had once ruled the air from bomber cockpits found themselves beneath the same destructive calculus, confined by wire, subject to forces they could neither control nor predict. In that moment, the illusion of safety dissolved. Guards who had mocked their prisoners faced the same terror, the same vulnerability. Captive and captor alike shared the truth of modern warfare. Survival was as much a matter of geography and timing as skill or rank. Yet amid the destruction, human resilience persisted. Injured prisoners and shaken guards worked side by side to rescue the living, tend to the wounded, and contain the fires. Discipline, ingenuity, and solidarity became shields as potent as walls or rifles. The men endured, marching into deeper winter, into uncertainty, carrying with them the indelible memory of the sky's indiscriminate judgment. The event also reflects a broader lesson about technology and strategy. The promise of precision bombing, so celebrated in doctrine and propaganda, collided with the unpredictable realities of winter weather, human error, and the limitations of radar. Even carefully calculated attacks could produce unintended consequences, reminding us that, in war, control is always partial, and destruction is rarely confined to intended targets. Historically, the bombing highlights the tragic intersection of strategy and humanity. It underscores how the logistics of warfare, rail lines, factories, and infrastructure can transform the lives of individuals far removed from the front lines. It reminds us that the cost of war is measured not only in territory gained or lost, but in the fragile human lives caught beneath the weight of industrialized violence. In the quiet aftermath, as survivors were marched toward distant camps, as smoke dissipated and snow settled over shattered buildings, a profound truth remained: war is indifferent, but humanity endures. And in that endurance, even amid devastation, the story of those American airmen and their captors carries a lesson that extends beyond history, a reminder of courage, resilience, and the unpredictable forces that shape the fate of all who live beneath the sky of conflict.